An eyewitness's account of a matter is a very moving thing for those who are interested in the event that they eyewitnessed. I'd like you for just a moment this morning to go back in time with me to April 9th, 1865. The greatest war America still has ever fought was with itself. And on April 9th, General Lee surrendered. The South stopped the Civil War. And just 5 days later, the victorious commander-in-chief, probably one of the most well-known people in the world, even still, Abraham Lincoln, was sitting in a quiet evening in the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. It was April 14th, 1865. And one of the actors from the theater, for still an unknown reason, came up to the box where Abraham Lincoln was sitting and mortally wounded our 16th president. Since then, people carry his picture around. In fact, I asked my wife if she had a picture of Abraham Lincoln with her this morning. 285 billion pictures of Abraham Lincoln have been circulated around the world. There are 285 billion pennies that have been minted since 1909. Also, the U.S. government always keeps 1.4 billion big pictures of Lincoln, always in circulation. That's the $5 bill. So throughout history, Abraham Lincoln has been the most produced face of any human being, more even than Christ. Pictures of Abraham Lincoln have flooded our planet and have been tossed into innumerable fountains and receptacles. This morning, I'd like to ask you, have you ever wondered what that night Abraham Lincoln had in his pockets the night he was assassinated? Have you ever wondered about that? Have you ever wondered what one of the most beloved, well-known people thought was important to him and they carried it with them? I mean, I think the only thing I have in my pockets are my car keys. I mean, everything else the kids take away from me. I always know where those are so I can get home. But what do you consider important enough to carry with you? Well, in the Library of Congress today, there's a beautiful purple velvet box. And in that box, and if you get permission and if the librarian will take you into the special room, and if they will open the vault, they will take this box out and they will lift the lid and show you the contents that an eyewitness that night of his assassination, as they took his bleeding and dying body away and emptied his personal effects, this person, this witness of the assassination, kept these items and then at a later time presented them to the U.S. government. I think they're very interesting testimony of what's important that an eyewitness saw of one of the most well-known images and people in the whole world. What was important to them? The contents of Lincoln's pockets that night that this eyewitness tells us about that have been preserved for us. First of all, he had a little handkerchief in his pocket, and it was embroidered in kind of a crude way. A. Lincoln. Some relative had probably done that for him, maybe one of his children. Then, he still carried with him a little broken, worn-out pocket knife that he had had as a little boy. He carried it with him everywhere. He had his spectacle case, which was broken, and he had tied a string through the hinge to hold it together and put another string around it. That was in his pocket. He had a little pocket purse, and all it had in it was a $5 bill. But listen, Confederate money. The South. That's all the money he had on him. And then, interestingly enough, stuck in that little purse were some folded up little scraps of newspaper articles that he had put in with his $5 bill. There were little worn-out clippings that spoke of the great deeds of Abraham Lincoln as president, and that said that one reporter had said that Abraham Lincoln perhaps was one of the greatest men of all times. That's what he thought was important. His little purse with some Confederate money, a little clipping about himself, his boyhood pocket knife, a little handkerchief someone had sewn for him, and his spectacle case that he tied together with a string. That's what the eyewitness saw that night. But as we look back 131 years later, I think that there's an interesting message. What did he think was important to him? Gifts of love. Someone had made that handkerchief for him. It was so important he carried it with him. Did you know when we give a gift of love, an expression of our love, a gift which often is an expression of love, that is something that can be very dear to people? And I think about that country boy's penknife. I think for Lincoln that was a reminder of how brief life was. I bet he could remember whittling with that knife. It just seemed like yesterday. And now he's the president. And he is elected for his second term. And he took his nation through the greatest turmoil they had ever known and perhaps will know. And he remembered how brief life was. And he remembered his poor, impoverished beginning. And he took his little, worn-out, almost useless pocket knife to remind him how brief life was. And then that spectacle case, tied up with string, reminds us how frail we are, how the longer we live, the more we fall apart, and the more we have to kind of hold ourselves together, and even objects that are dear to us fall apart. And we're very frail, and the Scriptures say we're just like a vapor. We appear for a little while. But that Confederate money, I thought about that for a long time. I think that's a painful memory. You know, sometimes we keep those with us too, don't we? Lincoln remembered how many sons and fathers of this nation were brought down to death in the reddened trenches of Gettysburg and many other places. Painful memories we keep with us. But then those old worn newspaper clippings were really interesting because I thought, yeah, we carry gifts and we carry reminders of our childhood and we carry around reminders of how frail we are and we carry around pain. But you know, what Lincoln really treasured, what he kept in that little purse was words of encouragement. Someone had taken the time to write an article of the man that was perhaps most despised in the nation at that time and most misunderstood, as they felt he brought upon this great conflagration. But someone had written a word of encouragement about him. And that was so important that he cut it out, and as the president, he rolled it up and put it in his little purse and kept some old worn newspaper clippings that reminded him that someone thought that he was worth consideration and positive thought. Today it's common knowledge that Lincoln was one of the greatest men of all times. The world knows that the British statesman John Bright, who wrote those words, was right in his assessment. And John Bright said he was perhaps the greatest statesman of all times, and we would agree, although most people in 1865 had a contrary opinion. But this morning, you have an even greater eyewitness account, greater than a little purple velvet box in the Library of Congress, greater than someone who was there and took the bloodied scraps out of the broken and dying body of Abraham Lincoln and preserved them for us, and someone that an eyewitness account told us what was important to him. We have, and I hope that you brought with you this morning, your own copy of the eyewitness account of God. Now, we can only guess what the purse was for and what the handkerchief was for and what the penknife was for and why the spectacle case had string around it and why he had $5 Confederate money and how he got those clippings. We can only speculate that. And I did speculate this morning. But there's no speculation needed because we have an authoritative, authentic, absolutely reliable account from God. And when I think of the Bible this morning, I think about the songwriter who said, "How firm a foundation, you saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in His excellent word." What more can He say than to you He has said, to you who for refuge to Jesus have fled? If you'd flee with me this morning to the 19th Psalm, I'd like to open with you and conclude the second of the great portraits of the Scripture we find in Psalm 19. We already have looked at the Scriptures telling us about the divine teacher. And that's the first of 6 self-portraits. I think about Michelangelo and the famous self-portrait he painted of himself. Well, this is God's self-portrait. Because God has revealed Himself in the Word. And in the Word, He says, I want you to see that I am, first of all, we saw a few weeks ago, the divine teacher. This morning, we're going to conclude God's self-revelation and description of Himself as the divine witness. He says, call me to the witness stand on any topic, and I will testify as an expert witness. And I will give you an eyewitness absolutely trustworthy account of whatever you ask me about. Look in Psalm 19 and verse 7. The testimony of the Lord is sure, and it makes wise the simple. Many mysteries of this world were witnessed, but not well enough to be explained. But the source that can give ultimate light on any mystery of origins, of purpose, of destiny, of life, of death, how the planet's going to end, how life began, when life begins, marriage, children, parenting, how to be successful, the ultimate witness, the testimony that can sublimely explain those things you hold in your hand this morning, because Psalm 19, 7 through 9, has 6 synonyms for God's word, 6 self-portraits, 6 inspired photos of the divine power of God's word to sufficiently and absolutely meet its purposes. Well, we have already begun our little pilgrimage through these. We saw that His perfect law restores because God is the divine teacher. That's the first part of verse 7. We saw His sure testimonies make us wise, and that's where we are this morning. He is the divine witness. That's the second part of verse 7. We're going to see in the future that His statutes can rejoice our heart as they give us divine direction for life, and if we follow those divine directions, we'll never get lost. In fact, we'll never be wandering around aimlessly, wondering what we're supposed to do in life. We'll never be desperately. In fact, I had lunch with someone this week, and they said, I'm always desperate. I said, I'm always hoping I'm not missing the boat. They said, I always want to jump on if something's going. I want to stay with it. I don't want to miss anything. I mean, they were really emphatic about it. They said, and I'm meeting with you because there might be something I don't want to miss. And I said, I don't go through life worrying that I missed some big deal, hoping that, I don't want to miss another big deal. I mean, life is not a bunch of big deals we miss. Life is living, as the Scriptures say, the work of righteousness is peace. The effects of righteousness, quietness and assurance. We can quietly be assured that we have the best of all lives if we follow the divine directions. And that's what we have. And we're going to see that in the future as we look at verse 8. The second part of verse 8 tells us the divine decrees, God's commandments, and they'll open our eyes. And if we see His commandments, we'll know His mind on matters. And then verse 9 starts out with the divine condition that we all should live in. And that condition is the fear of God. I called a dear friend of mine this week, and on his birthday, he was 85. And I called him on Friday and said, happy 85th birthday. I had to track him down. He's a spry old 85-year-old saint. He flies 75,000 miles a year. He preaches in excess of 400 or 500 times a year. He preaches 48 solid weeks a year, and so it was hard to find him. I mean, I was calling from state to state, tracking him down. I finally found him, and I said, what's your prayer request this year for our family to pray for, dear layman? And he says, it's the same request as last year. He says, I want to finish my course with joy. He said, I don't want to fail. And I says, how are you doing? He said, I'm doing well, but he says, another friend of mine in the ministry just defaulted and just left his church, just left his family, and found someone else's wife.